welcome back to another episode of Access Vikings. I'm Emily Leiker. Today, myself and my colleagues Andrew Krammer and Ben Goessling, all of us of the Minnesota Star Tribune, are answering questions from you guys, wrapping up OTAs, all of the offseason, really. There's some transactional stuff, questions in here, some outlook for the next season and honestly the next few years stuff in here. So we're going to dive right in right away because we got a whole host of these that we want to get to. And from Jem on Blue Sky, they asked, have you heard or saw at camp Josh Metellus playing a regular safety position rather than playing a third DB or a hybrid role? Obviously, we know Metellus last season especially was moved around a lot. Brian Flores in general moves a lot of his guys around. This is an interesting one, right? Because we did not see a ton of Josh Metellus in action. We did see him a little bit in 11-on-11 work, but he has some contract stuff, which we'll get into in a second. But just from an outlook of what his role might look like this year, what are you guys thinking?
Yeah, Ben, I wouldn't expect it's going to be a lot different than what it's been. I mean, I think Theo Jackson probably makes sense to slip into that Cam Bynum type role. I would expect they'd continue to want to do what they've done with Josh Metellus. I mean, the way they have turned him into a key piece of this defense and a key candidate for a contract extension is by playing him in that kind of rover role where he sometimes is in the box, sometimes he's playing almost as a linebacker, sometimes he is able to drop into coverage, he can be a slot corner. I mean, I don't think they are looking at Cam Bynum's departure as a reason to change his role. I think a lot of Theo Jackson being here and getting the deal that he got is so that they don't have to move him that much. Now, what that means for a contract is pretty interesting because how do you value him? How do you define his position? Is he matching up against safeties? Is he matching up against linebackers? Is he kind of his own thing? I mean, I can remember this was a big debate with Jimmy Graham back when he was trying to get a deal from the Saints. And I think that was a franchise tag thing, if I recall correctly. But should he be getting franchise tagged as a receiver, I think was what his camp was trying to argue. So I don't know that this is that. It's not quite that cut and dried. It doesn't need to be if they all find a price that everybody likes. But that part of things, how you value and how you categorize Metellus, I think is an interesting component to these negotiations.
Yeah, we saw him line up at deep safety, and he's going to do that. But Ben, I think you're totally right. Like they pay Theo Jackson. Josh is the guy who's been here. He's already got his many roles carved out. Yeah. And Theo's the guy who's going to step in and probably play predominantly what Cam Bynum used to do. But I do think when they go with their standard nickel 3 corner package, which we saw a little bit of in minicamp here with Jeff Okudah and with Isaiah Rodgers with Byron Murphy, I do think you're going to see Metellus on the field instead of Theo. I do think Metellus is still probably going to be more of the starter guy at that spot, and Theo is that third safety who will play in a deep role when they go with 3 safeties. That's at least just the vibe based on the personnel they've shifted when they do 11-on-11 and Josh is participating. But I don't think they're going to ask Josh to suddenly start doing a bunch of half-field coverages. No. I don't think that's who he is as a player. I think they know what Flores obviously knows what he's good at and is going to continue to ask him to do those things. And then, yeah, Ben, like you said, whether or not they pay him is going to be really interesting because Cam Bynum he goes and he tests the market and he gets $15 million a year. Yeah. Is Josh worth that to the Vikings? I don't know. Clearly Cam wasn't because the Colts paid him and the Vikings didn't. So Josh is a different evaluation, but one that's kind of similar in that it was a mid to late round pick, a guy who's really maxed out who he is as a football mind and as a player.
I think got cut at one point. I always forget that part of the story with him.
Yeah, and Joshua was very quick to mention that. I remember I asked him after one of these minicamp practices about, are you anxious seeing Josh Oliver, seeing Van Ginkel, seeing these guys get paid and you're not? And he said, man, I was more anxious when I got cut. And he references that so much because clearly he holds on to that kind of grudge as all these guys do. But yeah, like you said, it's just he's come so far. Do they view him as a guy who's worth paying like some of these first round picks who have that kind of first round talent and pedigree that frankly Josh just doesn't?
Here's the other thing I would add to this discussion very quickly. We talk about him in regard to his role in Brian Flores' defense. Yeah. And the reason I bring that up is Brian Flores is also in a contract year. There is, I think, interest in an extension from the team. I will be curious to see if Flores decides to sign something or if he tries to test the market, because he was in those head coaching conversations last year with a couple of teams. I wonder how that's going to go. And if he does test the market, if it's a coordinator job somewhere else, if it's a head coaching job somewhere else, is whoever replaces him, that could be internal, it could be Durante Jones, it could be Mike Saravo, whoever it would happen to be, maybe that system is the same. But if it's not Flores, if it's not exactly the same, does Metellus have the same value if somebody else is calling the plays? It's just one of those things to kind of pin to the clipboard, so to speak, as we're thinking about these things. And it obviously they're going to have to make a decision on Metellus sooner than that, I would think. I mean, I suppose you wouldn't have to, but it makes sense probably to do it if you're going to do it sooner than later. But it's one of those things just to kind of file away. It's, I think, an interesting component of this, and just wanted to kind of put it on the clipboard, so to speak. So if you're thinking about this, keep that in the back of your mind, I guess.
We mentioned in that conversation Theo Jackson. We had a question about him from Skull Vikes on X. What's Theo Jackson's role looking like coming into this year? I was really excited to see the extension and hoping we see a lot more of him. For those who don't remember, he was the first one to get an extension this offseason, I believe. They were pretty early on him. We did see a lot of him, especially with Josh off to the side. I think he got a little bit more play in mini camp. But what do we kind of envision this next level looking like for him? Andrew, let's start with you.
Yeah, I think Brian Flores had talked about it earlier in minicamp this week, and he had mentioned that Theo's kind of doing everything that we expected him to do, and when we paid him, we expected him to step into a bigger role and play at a pretty good clip. And so, what is a bigger role? He's a guy that hasn't played a ton on defense. He's had a few spot starts here and there, like Metellus did his first couple of years, and maybe he can gradually kind of grow into that. I don't think the expectation should be, though, what Josh did, which was go from just a spot starter to suddenly this full-time player. Josh was able to do so many things that not many players can do, which is probably his argument for getting paid. But I don't think Theo is going to suddenly start doing a lot of inside linebacker reps. We do see him play in the slot. We do see him play deep. And like we mentioned earlier, I would expect his role to be as that third safety off the bench, which they'll often use. But I would still expect Josh Metellus to be on the field more than him.
Theo Jackson, game-sealing interception against the Seahawks late last season. That was probably a big deal in getting him that contract extension. And the first guy propping him up in that locker room, I'll say, was Josh Metellus. Right. So all of that's tied together. Flipping to the offensive side of the ball, from Jet Edwards on X, how has Tai Felton looked? Odds he competes for number 3 wide receiver. Now, we talked a little bit about progress that Jalen Naylor, who's currently the wide receiver 3 or was the wide receiver 3 last summer or last season, made entering this summer. Tai looked good. What we saw of him, he looked like the guy that they said they drafted and they wanted in this draft in terms of some of the speed. I know there was some comments on his height and his length as a pass catcher. But what do we think of the odds of him like coming in and really competing in this wide receiving room that obviously has really talented guys at the top of it?
I mean, I would think it's going to be an uphill battle for him to compete right away, simply because Jalen Naylor is somebody they've liked for a long time. Mm-hmm. They have kept the door open for him as he's had injuries, because I think they felt like he can be a big contributor in this offense if he's healthy and gets the opportunity to do so. So, I mean, we've all noted Jalen Naylor's increased frame. I mean, just he's bigger because he spent the offseason in the weight room. We've noted that part of it with him as well. I think it's a good problem for them to have, but I think the way they feel about Jalen Naylor and the time he has logged in this offense probably gives him a leg up on Tai Felton for that number 3 job at the moment. Now, where that goes in the long term, I think is going to be very, very interesting to watch, because Jordan Addison heading into year 3, I would think they pick up the 5th-year option probably on him, but does he get paid long term knowing that you're paying Justin Jefferson? And I suppose even that 5th-year option, contracts like Justin Jefferson's and Jamar Chase's are going to nudge that number up. So that is going to be a very interesting discussion with him in the next year or so. And it will play into what they decide to do with Naylor. And then Tai Felton, will have some years here in that rookie contract that gives them an affordable kind of alternative to him. So even if it doesn't happen for him right away, it's going to be an interesting discussion because they'll have to make a decision on Jordan Addison in the next couple of years here. And the presence of some of these other players could factor into the decision they make on Addison.
Yeah, I totally agree. I would not expect Tai Felton to be wide receiver 3 or maybe even wide receiver 4 if it just doesn't come together right away for him this summer. I think we hear a lot from wide receivers about how this offense asks a lot of not only the quarterback, but of those other skill position groups, specifically at wide receiver, where they do make route adjustments and change things. And I wonder how much more those guys are going to be shouldering, or maybe even simplifying, just changing in general, whether more or less with a new quarterback in JJ McCarthy, who's obviously less experienced than even Darnold. But with Felton, he's coming in and they keep talking about special teams, and Keenan McCardell, talking to him a couple weeks ago, he had mentioned that even he, the wide receivers coach, is saying, no, this guy's going to help us on special teams first. There's a lot of different things he can do for us. They still view Jalen Nailor as that bona fide wide receiver 3. I think the competition that's interesting at that position is more so who's going to be, we know Felton will make the roster, who's 5 and who's 6, and do they keep 6 if they're going to focus more on tight ends and bulking up and heavier personnel sets. So I would imagine they keep 6, and you got Rondale Moore, you've got Jayshon Jones. They've got some interesting guys, and then undrafted free agents they spent quite a bit of money on as well. So it is a good position for competition, but it feels like, as O'Connell and as we all talked about on the last podcast, that top 3 feels pretty set. And then Felton is a guy who's probably the guy who's up next after Nailor's contract expires here coming up after this year.
Now, we might see, it's worth noting that we might see some of Tai early because we're unsure what the situation with Jordan Addison is going to be regarding his court case that he has that will be this week. Ben, do we know anything more about the timeline of that besides that it's happening this week, or jury selection's happening?
Yeah, I mean, there was a jury trial setting conference scheduled for Monday. So how long it takes from there, I mean, you got to pick a jury and get going with the trial. I can't imagine the trial itself is going to take terribly long. I would think that's probably one that's, a few days. I wouldn't think it's going to be much longer than that, but yeah, that's kind of where we're at. I would think we'll have a resolution to that this summer. I wouldn't think that will take too much longer. And obviously when that is resolved, the NFL will look at all of it and make its decision based on the result of the case. And I think if there is any type of conviction, the standard would be a 3-game suspension for a first-time offender of the alcohol policy in the NFL. And if there's a legal ramification in an alcohol case, I would think 3 games is probably what you're looking at. Now, I suppose they could say it's less than that, but I mean, 3 games seems to be kind of the standard of what you're talking about these days. So if that happens, it would be, I would assume this gets all done this summer and that the NFL would levy that suspension for the start of the regular season. So you're talking about, in that case, his first game back would be when they go to Ireland to face the Steelers on September 28th. So yes, worth keeping that in mind, because I do think we are heading toward some type of a resolution to that probably in the next few weeks here. I can't imagine a jury trial for a DUI arrest is going to be something that stretches on for weeks.
Right, probably not. From Michigan Scolger on X, how are the running backs looking? I'm afraid that we don't have a guy with the burst that if a hole opens by the O-line, they can take it 50, 60, 70 without getting chased down. Andrew, I know you pulled some numbers about this related to Aaron and then Jordan Mason as well.
Yeah, because we all thought this and we all watched the Vikings season with Aaron starting so well the way that he did, and then the injuries just piled up and mounted. And to actually put the numbers in front and kind of look at them, it's obvious what the Vikings want to do. I think Aaron's still got that speed. He's 30 years old. Obviously, it's going to wane a little bit and maybe be less, have less endurance over the stretch of a 17-game season. But he had a career high in touches, and he had 18 starts, including that playoff game. So he was available, but he was on 7 of the last 13 injury reports. And this is after starting the year, reaching 20 miles per hour in 3 of the first 6 games. And he didn't do that the rest of the season when he was banged up. And those injuries were hip, hamstring, ribs, back, quad. I mean, every part of his body. It was like a game of operation with this guy. So I think
all right in the core too.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So I think they want to just use Mason and split this up. And we're going to talk. That's one storyline that will be talked about ad nauseum come training camp and with fantasy football people is how is this split going to be? Certainly they do not want, I think, Aaron Jones reaching that 300 touch mark by week 18 again.
No, and I think a lot of those touches for Addison, like we've talked about a little bit, are probably more of the high contact, I guess, for lack of a better term, runs up the middle, runs in heavy personnel situations, goal to go, short yardage. It's not going to be just that because he's shown he's able to do more than that. Certainly showed it against the Vikings last year, but you are going to see him get more of those touches, I would expect, in those situations, which may help preserve Aaron Jones a little bit. I'm sure that's part of the reason they did what they did with Jordan Mason, with the idea that you keep Jones a little fresher, maybe a little more of that juice that he's shown he still can summon on a lot of occasions. Maybe a little more of that's available if you keep him a little fresher.
Right. Well, and the speed's obviously a big part of it for getting to 70 yards, but you have to have the physicality to break through that second level first to even be trying to outrun the secondary and take it to the house or whatever. And so I think, I mean, we all know Jordan Mason is like their big, like, physicality poster boy. It feels like they brought him in and he's like, yeah, I just like to hit people. I just like to run through people and all of that. So I think it'll be a fun day for Vikings fans whenever Jordan Mason does break out of that second level for the first time and really like bodies someone and takes it really far down the field.
Hashtag play style.
Obviously a lot of OTAs talk, minicamp talk was also kind of like just looking forward over to the outlook of this season and even beyond. And we got some very emphatic moments from Harrison Phillips pounding his fist at the podium and different people talking about things. Let's start with this and get some more JJ McCarthy talk in here because we know everyone loves JJ McCarthy talk. From Warren W. on Threads, do Vikings have any benchmarks or goals regarding McCarthy's progress this offseason?
Yeah, Ben, how would you answer that?
Well, I'm pausing because I don't know that they're going to share them.
No.
Anything concrete. I'm sure they have some of those things, but I think they talk so much about process over results that I would imagine any of the benchmarks are more process related than we need to see you complete this many passes or anything like that. I think more of it is show us you have a full command of the offense. Show us you have the ability to understand how these plays work and have a process for digesting opposing coverages, digesting how the playbook comes together for the Vikings, finding answers to different coverages you're going to see. I think that is very much the things you hear them talk about. I mean, a lot of the discussion is, I think, first on how he processed a play and how he read a coverage. What was his decision-making process to get to a certain read and say, I'm going to say no to this and say yes to this. Those are the things they seem to be talking about with him as much as anything else. And then obviously delivery with mechanics and footwork. That's something they've worked on with him, is a couple of subtle footwork changes in ways that they want their quarterbacks to play as opposed to what he'd done in the past. So it's more on those types of things. Those are at least the conversations I hear them having with him and some of the things that they talk about. So if there is some benchmark of yardage or touchdowns or success rate or any of that kind of stuff, I don't think you're going to hear them share that publicly with as carefully as they've kind of handled this whole thing, how as carefully as they've managed it. But I think the discussion with him is more this idea of how do you go about executing the job in all of the ways that this offense requires you to do it. And a lot of that is just, what is your decision-making structure and process look like?
Yeah, I think that's got to be it in terms of how they do it, because we know we know everybody tracks everything on every NFL team, and we know they've got his completions for attempts and in every red zone period, every 7-on-7, every 11-on-11, and they track them, and they've got them from years past of where Sam Darnold was compared to where JJ is. But how much do they obsess over those numbers versus just where this kid's supposed to be, and as Kevin calls it, his quarterback journey? So I think Ben's totally right. Like, I do not think they're going to obsess and be like, oh my gosh, he was 5 of 10, but Sam last year in this period was 8 of 10 or whatever. It's more of, okay, was that 5? What happened on those 5? Were these mistakes that he had previously made before and he keeps making? Were these new mistakes? How do we need to coach it? You often hear O'Connell talk about how, we have to look at ourselves and how do we coach these things? Are we reaching him if these are repeat mistakes? All that kind of stuff. And I think Aaron Jones said it to our colleague Chip Scoggins for his column this week about how he's got to do so much stuff with this offense. I imagine the progress and the benchmarks are just more of a percentage of how many plays are cleanly operated, from calling the play in the huddle to getting people lined up, to doing the right motions, to getting the cadence correctly down, to getting the pass protection set with Ryan Kelly, and then to actually processing everything and getting rid of the ball once the play is snapped. Aaron Jones talked about how there are times where we'll have motions within a play and I have to like stop him and remind him, no, don't start your cadence here. We've got a motion we have to finish, or the guy has to get set before you do that or whatever, because he's got a million other things in his head. I think Sam Darnold naturally should be, I don't know if this is true because we're not seeing their evaluations. They're not sitting us down and saying, hey guys, here's where he's at exactly. But I would imagine Sam Darnold was farther along at this point than JJ is. I don't know that for a fact, but I would just imagine, based on the amount of knowledge Sam had from previous NFL offenses, from seeing defenses before. We're hearing O'Connell talk a lot about, kind of setting the table with Flores and making sure that he's not spinning too many fastballs at this young kid. Cause like, hey, we need this kid to learn. I think all this is just fascinating to see, and where he's at is going to be kind of this shadowy, cloaked thing until we get to see him week 1.
Well, and just really quickly, Andrew, you bring it up with Flores and the young quarterbacks. I mean, how many young quarterbacks did we see last year? Yeah, just at their wits' end with that defense. I mean, the Brock Purdy clip of him coming up to Flores after that game week 2 and saying scheme's crazy, and that got a lot of run, but this is what J.J. McCarthy is practicing against every day. And I remember talking to O'Connell and Flores about this a little bit at the end of last season. O'Connell said there's what he called dealer's choice periods, where it is, I don't want you to send everything in this period because we're trying to get this base concept installed and make sure we can just get a clean look at it without you guys bringing pressure from 6 different places that we have to figure out adjusting protection to. There are going to be times where they want J.J. McCarthy to sift through that and try to figure it out without, having the training wheels on. But there are also times where they do, like you say, just need to get things installed and get things run. So yeah, the way this defense has played on the minds of young QBs is now what J.J. McCarthy is practicing against every day. So it is, it's one of those things, like you say, that they have to kind of manicure pretty carefully.
Right. Well, and not to get too far away from just answering questions here, but we didn't talk a ton about some of the in-depth McCarthy stuff we heard when we wrapped up minicamp last week. But one thing I thought that was interesting that KO said was in response to a question about like letting JJ kind of test his limits and test some riskier passes and just situational stuff throughout minicamp, and obviously getting that thrown at him by Brian Flores' defense, just because when like it's so much different to just throw a ball and like maybe like simulate a tight window versus like an actual tight window in the game. So I'm just going to read off something that O'Connell said yesterday, which was, you go through the phase of trying to do exactly how you think it on paper it's supposed to be done. And then these are living, moving, very world-class, talented athletes out on the field where it doesn't always translate to what the paper looked like or the picture, even the clip that we installed the play off of. So you get out of this kind of structure that you still have to have, but then there's a feel of how far can I test that? But then you pretty quickly learn that you better be doing it with the right principles. You can't predetermine, hey, I'm going to do this and this is going to happen. You do that and you don't play fast with fast eyes and feet and eyes tied together. Some bad things can happen in a hurry. And so like just this idea, I think this ties to a larger point that I just wanted to bring the McCarthy full circle here on, that like there's a reason we did not drop how many interceptions we saw JJ throw on any of these podcasts, because this was very much like a learning period for him. And so whatever benchmarks they did have, like, I don't think they wanted to make public in this period because they knew like there was going to be like, who knows if those benchmarks were even like reached, just because they might have set lofty ones, they might have set weird ones, whatever. So like, I get the question for sure. And like wanting to know, like, are there certain statistics that they're looking for JJ, or are they looking to make sure he has 100 play calls memorized or whatever? But that's just really not how this coaching staff approaches his development.
Yeah. And it's a super interesting discussion because it does get to a lot of what we're talking about here in the sense of how you get him ready to play and how much of that is kind of this amorphous thing of you kind of just know it when you see it, to kind of use that old phrase. But if you're coming to training camp next month, my encouragement to you as you're in the stands would be to watch these things, because it is very interesting to see how they're going to install things in a practice and how certain concepts may play out differently if they give Brian Flores opportunities to kind of turn things loose. And it does become a little more chaotic for JJ McCarthy against certain looks or certain pressures. And so completions, interceptions, all of that stuff is not as interesting to me as, okay, there's a moment here where they brought protection, or they brought pressure in a way that the Vikings did not have protected. What did McCarthy do to respond to that? I mean, if you're coming to watch practices, my encouragement would be to spend less time on the highlights and less time on the stats and stat counting in practices, and more just watching things and processing the plays, because that stuff I think is going to be really interesting to watch, how they bring a young quarterback along in this particular Kwesi called it a QB incubator when he was on with us a couple of weeks ago. This incubator also involves a defense that gives you a certain kind of test that I think is just going to be fascinating to watch. So for as much as we will inevitably get caught up in statistics from practices and highlights that people tweet out from the stands and all of those kinds of things, the way that these practices play out and how they structure them, I think is going to be more interesting to watch if you want to learn what they're going to do and how they feel about him overall.
Let's zoom out for these next couple questions. We'll start with from Roger N on X. Besides injuries, what are the most likely negative scenarios for the Vikings this year? Is strength of schedule the most likely reason they wouldn't make the playoffs, or is there something on the team where they're an area on the team where they're particularly vulnerable, like the O-line last season? Obviously, the O-line and the sacks and Darnold's inability to process when pressure was bearing down on him is kind of what ended that season last year with the Lions and the Rams game. Do we think there's something akin to that? Because based on the Vikings' efforts this offseason, we would not think that it would be the O-line again.
It's a good question, especially when you throw the caveat besides injuries, because that's the one that you naturally go to, like, well, if Jefferson gets hurt or whatever. I would say that the secondary, the corners, it's just going to take some more Flores kind of magic for me to see this all come together. And when you don't have, and this time last year, they didn't have Stephon Gilmore signed. He didn't sign till August. So he could sign again because he's a free agent, apparently still taking his tours. He was in Dallas, it looked like last month. So they could change things. This could look different, but as it is looking now, it's Jeff Okudah or Mekhi Blackman as your corner, as your third corner, or it's Theo Jackson as your third safety. And however that takes shape, it's less experience, it's less career interceptions, it's less proven communication, all these things that they need in the back end. And frankly, even though they had it last year, because they were older, they got taken advantage of at times. Stephon Gilmore pulls a hamstring when they ask him to play man-to-man coverage against the Cardinals late in the season. I think back to some of their losses, that secondary, including against the Rams.
Shaq Griffin against the Rams is the one that comes to my mind.
Yeah, they looked old. They looked out of place at times, just gotten beat by younger, faster guys. So that they bring in Isaiah Rodgers, who's a younger, faster guy. And if he can't live up to the standard that they're hoping for, that's one way that this could be a negative and go wrong. But this defensive line if they're healthy, if injuries do not affect them, I have a hard time seeing how that group is not incredibly better. And then that then is going to make the corner's job that much easier.
Yeah, I mean, the corners were where my mind went initially, but I think the biggest one, and this is a little bit of the elephant in the room here, aside from injuries, is that JJ McCarthy just isn't ready to answer the bell.
Yeah.
Because if that happens, that has a wide-ranging set of consequences, because we have seen this. I mean, Andrew, you and I started our time on this beat in this situation. I mean, we started watching a young quarterback try to develop, and reputations were staked on him, and it did not work out. And then it became this discussion of who is going to bear the responsibility for that. And of course, I will pause for a second. Everybody knows the name I'm going to name here, but Christian Ponder is the quarterback that we started covering at the beginning of our respective times on the beat. My first year was 2012. I think Andrew's was 2013. So we saw, I saw the moment that against the Packers in week 17 of that season that made them say, hey, maybe Ponder's starting to figure it out. And then 2013 was that season when they decided, no, he's not. And that ultimately led to kind of this split between Rick Spielman and Leslie Frazier, and it cost Leslie Frazier his job. And I don't think Leslie Frazier was completely on board with Ponder anymore either, but a lot of discussions of where you should play him, how much rope you should give him. Should, Matt Castle, the veteran backup, start? I mean, a lot of those decisions had a result in that season where the division was up for grabs, and ultimately led to Leslie Frazier losing his job at the end of that year. So I just bring that up to say that if JJ McCarthy is not up to snuff, then there are big existential questions that come with that. And nobody's going to lose a job. These two guys just got extensions. JJ McCarthy is somebody they're very excited about. It's not going to be anybody after this year saying, let's cut bait on any of this. I'm not saying that at all. But these are the tightropes you walk with these types of situations, because everybody knows that reputations are staked on quarterback decisions. I think the people that made this decision know that if they don't get this figured out, then there's going to be people to answer to that sign your paychecks. So, I mean, that whole thing, if he doesn't look like he's ready to do it, and I don't have any reason to think that he won't be, but if we're talking about reasons to say, hey, hang on here, I mean, that's the one that you do have to just acknowledge, because we don't know yet. And they've said we don't know yet. There's a lot of projection that has to happen here, and there's a lot riding on that projection being right.
Yeah, JJ was where my head went as well, just because, even if, he has a rocky start, but then gets into it later, which I think is totally something that could happen, especially considering some of the teams and the scenarios they play in early, right? Starting with those 2 primetime games and then facing the Bengals and all of that, that heat, because there is already so much heat on him and then this team as a whole, because he is this highly lauded rookie quarterback.
He's also going to be a new dad in his first month as a starting quarterback in the NFL, we should mention.
Yeah. There is a big pressure bubble blooming up around this whole situation, and it's kind of does it get popped or does it just fizzle out and become a non-starter? Will be interesting. In a similar vein, from Mike P on X, what reason do Vikings fans have to hope this year will bring a different outcome compared to every other season? Just one before we die. Also JJ ?
Oh boy. So on the flip side, why could they win it all, basically, is the question.
Yeah. He's not talking about one trip to the Super Bowl before he dies, is he? Because, I mean, there are people getting to be about half their life just waiting for a trip to the Super Bowl.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's got to be because this roster is obviously they turned it around in free agency a year ago. And if they hit similar home runs in free agency this year as they did last year, and Donovan Jackson is a very good starting guard right out of the gate. And JJ McCarthy is the opposite of what Ben was just talking about. He's great. He's phenomenal. He's the next Patrick Mahomes, nothing to worry about. Then you can do it. And you don't need to be Patrick Mahomes. I'm obviously being facetious. You can be.
And he's being likened to Josh Allen anyway, right?
Yeah, right. Or Sean Mannion, if you listen to Josh Metellus. He's like, he can really sling it like Sean Mannion. We're like, what?
How about that for a range of comparisons? We were Josh Allen Allen and Sean Mannion in the same month about JJ McCarthy.
Yeah. Oh my God. And he doesn't need to be, he doesn't need to be Josh Allen, but he does need to be better than Sean Mannion for the Vikings to win the Super Bowl. But if he can just be a Brock Purdy, in terms of just how he can process and pick things up quickly and be that point guard for the offense, he doesn't need to make the physically incredible plays that Sam Darnold did last year, especially if they can pass protect up the middle and run the ball more effectively. I do think these things can happen. You just need health. You need especially health like 2017 when it all came together for this group. That year, I think the only defender to miss extended time was Sendejo, and it was like 3 games. They were just incredibly healthy that entire season. So they need all that to come together, and their talent obviously is there. I think it's worthy when you look at it on paper.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about, you mentioned the free agency thing. I mean, last year they signed a second-team All-Pro, a Pro Bowler, a running back that had career highs in a number of categories, a middle linebacker, an inside linebacker that became an instrumental part of the defense, a corner that played awfully well in his mid-30s, and who am I forgetting? Well, a quarterback that made a Pro Bowl for the first time in his career and was in MVP conversations, at least briefly. That is not a hit rate that you expect to be able to just roll out and repeat every year. But if they did that, I mean, say they signed a Pro Bowler or 2, that makes this defense look a lot different. And I do think, if one of those corners hits, for example, say Isaiah Rodgers is as good as they hope he can be, or Jeff Okudah, who was the 3rd pick in the draft, plays at that level. Speaking of guys that were the former 3rd picks in the draft that needed a chance to resurrect their careers in Minnesota. We saw that with Sam Darnold. It's a different position, obviously. But if you got that out of one of those corners and maybe say one of those defensive linemen, and then you have what you have on offense with, linemen in Kelly and Fries' case that are pretty proven. I don't think it's a big projection to say that they come in and help and make a big difference. Then you are talking about, you mentioned Brock Purdy. You're talking about that kind of a situation where you don't have to come in and be the hero because you just get the ball to all of the people that they have to play. And this is a front office that has good relationships with the 49ers. Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah obviously worked there. Kevin O'Connell was there briefly. They think highly of the way the 49ers do things. And I'm sure it has not been lost on them that if you can put a group around a young quarterback like that, there's a chance to go do some big things. I mean, Brock Purdy was the last pick in the draft and has quarterbacked a Super Bowl early in his career. I'm sure they're saying, if that can happen, are you telling me that it can't happen with pick number 10 in the draft? I mean, that would be the counter to all of the stuff we're talking about before. That's why this season is going to be so fascinating, is that you have this powder keg of a 14-win team and a young quarterback that they're excited about that still hasn't done it. And you have a fan base that is, I think, hoping for the guy at quarterback. I mean, they want to win a Super Bowl, but they also want to have that Super Bowl team come together around a guy that is like the foundational player at the most important position in sports. So it is going to be a very, very fun year to cover. And I just think the storylines and how all of this goes is going to be a lot of fun to watch.
A lot of talk about cornerbacks in those 2 questions, in addition to quarterbacks. But for cornerbacks, Tyler on X asked, if you had to put a percentage on it, what are the odds of the Vikings signing Jair Alexander?
Wouldn't put it very high.
Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like they just got a close-up enough look of him, in Green Bay all these years and all these matchups and these games. And I don't know. If the price is right, sure. I imagine Brian Flores would take anybody with his level of talent in thinking that he could kind of get him to do what he wants him to do, because Jair's obviously kind of done his own thing from time to time in Green Bay.
Coin toss.
So I don't know, Ben, but it seems like we're all on the same page here that it seems unlikely with that one.
Yeah, I mean, the durability stuff, I think, is what you'd first bring up there. I mean, that's been a big question with him. And how many of those things last year were things where he was saying, I don't really want to go out and push this because I don't have a great relationship with the team. I mean, those things are a little bit unknowable in terms of how much every decision was being made by that, but I'm sure it didn't help. So, yeah, I mean, that one, I think there's a lot of question marks there. I think the more likely landing place for Jair Alexander would be with a coach somewhere that has been with him and has coached him. And obviously Mike Pettin has had him before, so there's familiarity in that sense of things. But, a position coach or a coordinator that has had him on the roster, I mean, I'm not sure where Joe Barry is at this point, but, those kinds of things where somebody has enough familiarity with him to advocate for him. And maybe that is Mike Pettin, but it could also be, no, I've been around this guy enough to say, yeah, this isn't really worth it for us. But the durability questions and the injury questions, I think, are the ones that would make them maybe say, yeah, it's hard to justify the price. Because the other thing is they do have to think about price. They spent a lot of money in free agency this year. I think they want to roll a little bit of that cap space over. Doesn't mean they're not going to go out and get somebody big at some point if they feel like that can put them over the top. But there is a lot of consideration of 2026 and kind of just this life cycle of, hey, let's have a core that can kind of subsist on its own without a ton of big expensive additions. Maybe it's draft picks more so than expensive free agents. So I think all of those things are worth considering, and it may be why they say, yeah, it's not the time for that.
Also, I think if we look at their MO at corner, it was just interesting to see them last year cycle through so many options in the summer, and they just take their time and bring in Fabian Moreau and bring in Bobby McCain. Trying to think of how many.
Right.
So many other guys. They traded for Wright, and then eventually mid-August, they're like, "All right, Stefan, we'll pay you because we just can't make this work with all these budgetary options." So I imagine they'll continue to try and do the same thing. Because Isaiah Rodgers himself is kind of a budget move for the level of role that they want him to play. So they're clearly, they clearly spent their top dollar on Byron Murphy and are just kind of pinching pennies around him.
Couple fun ones to wrap us up here. We'll start with from Skull Fan Am on X. What do you guys miss most about Mankato? This is a question that only you guys can answer. I've never been to Mankato.
How honestly can we answer it?
Regale me.
The Mr. Mankato days where that was Adam Thielen once upon a time, right?
Yeah.
Was he the original Mr. Mankato or was there one before him?
I think that was the original. And that was the first of my three-peat.
Is Mr.
Mankato?
Is Mr. Mankato what I think it is, or is it what is it?
It was basically crowning like the top training camp player. It was just like whoever comes out, and it had to have been like a late round pick or an undrafted rookie or just a journeyman who would come out of nowhere to steal the hearts and minds of everybody who was watching. So
didn't somebody try to say like a second round pick could be Mr. Mankato at some point? Wasn't there a push for that? Like, no, this has got to be a like day 3 or later, I think was.
Yeah, you're probably right. I do remember one time like Diggs was eligible because he was a 5th round pick, and that didn't feel fair because he was just out.
I think the second year, I think it was Thielen and then Diggs the next year, wasn't it?
Yeah, he was just out there torching people, and it was just a 5th round pick because he was kind of a malcontent apparently. So, but very good. A very good one.
Yeah.
On the football field. What do I miss most about Mankato? I miss covering camp there. I do. I mean, because it was like you went and you were just there for 2-3 weeks and everybody was there and away from their families. And it felt like this kind of event that you all just got to kind of, even though you weren't on certainly practicing or in meeting rooms, but you all kind of shared this kind of experience together, as opposed to now training camp practices are like every other practice. We go to the same facility. They go to work the same place. They go home, there isn't the shared nights, some of the stuff that we can't talk about after hours that would happen. But I think that the communal aspect of it is certainly what I miss.
Yes, I will we can be discreet about it to some degree, but the fact that there aren't that many places to go for dinner or otherwise evening refreshments in Mankato means you bump into a lot of people. So you just have a lot more conversations with people. It was always, I think, even coming off the practice field, there was one way the players could go out, and you could just talk to a lot more guys, have longer conversations, because the autograph hounds were all kind of waiting at one spot. So they'd talk to you and then they'd go sign autographs. And then you'd see guys just around the campus because we would always work on the campus. And then, there are only probably 4 or 5 restaurants that everybody kind of bounced around to. I mean, it always got to the point where I think like week 2 down there, it was always kind of, our stays on our time on the beat weren't as long as they used to be. But yeah, even a week and a half, 2 weeks that we'd be down there, you're kind of like, okay, we got, what are the restaurants? Tav on the Ave, number 4, Boulder Tap, always had pretty good wings. And then, Johnny B's was always kind of where you'd end up. I mean, the days of Boomtown that you'll hear kind of Chip and Judd Zolgad and Kevin Seifert and all of the kind of the older guard of beat writers talk about, we were past that, but Johnny B's kind of became the gathering spot towards the end of the night. So you bump into a lot of people there, and it was an easier way to build relationships and not friendships necessarily, but you just build some level of understanding the people you're covering on a level that goes beyond reporter and subject. They get to know you get to know them a little bit more. I think all of those things were fun, and there's just good stories and good inside jokes from our time on the beat that kind of persist and all of those things. But just the thing I miss the most is it just helped you do your job, I think, more effectively because of how much time and access you had down there.
Quasi, we know you listen to the podcast. Maybe we consider moving it back to Mankato is what I'm hearing.
I remember they always used to talk. I mean, they used to pay lip service mostly to this idea. Well, we might go down there to do a scrimmage or something, but there's no way. I mean, they have everything they want. I mean, we always saw it. They had to set up like a cold tub in a temporary tent, didn't they? I mean,
yeah, and they did not spend what must be now hundreds of millions of dollars to build this 200, 300 acre complex to draw people into a different city,
right?
For them to watch them play or practice or whatever. No, anything they do is going to try to draw people to their coffers in Egan. For sure.
The city of Egan also would probably not be terribly keen on the idea that they would move it back to Mankato. It's a nice idea, but. No, sadly, I think those days are gone.
We'll wrap up with this one from Jerry S. on X. And I will say, Jerry, we're going to read off this question because I appreciate you sending it in. I don't know that any of us can aptly answer it because we were not alive.
Correct.
But Jerry said, I grew up with the Vikings in the 60s, starting in 61. Been through all 4 Super Bowl disappointments. Been waiting a long time to see if we'd ever get back. Can you do a comparison between this team and the 70s Vikings?
Jerry could probably do a better one than we can.
Jerry, come on the pod.
What do you think the 70s Vikings would do with Justin Jefferson? Like, what do you think? Like, that just looking like how he plays, what he does. I feel like they would look at him like it was Space Jam. Not to say that like Carl Eller and all them weren't like freakish athletes and amazing, but Jefferson and what these guys do today, it's just obviously on a different level.
I think their response to that would be, are we playing by 2025 rules or are we playing by 1970s rules? Because if we're playing by 1970s rules, I think I know what they would say they'd do to him.
It would push him out, bury him into the ground 10 feet under.
Smoke him when he's going over the middle.
Yeah.
I also just can't imagine football players in the 1970s taking well to the gritty. It's just not something I can fathom. Like that level of celebration, I don't think was happening. I think they'd kind of outcast him in the locker room, being like, "Why are you doing some weird dance?" Probably worse language than that in the end zone.
Yeah, that's probably true. That's probably true. No, we can't really compare it. Just different eras of football, different teams. What's interesting though, Ben, is that these Vikings teams, the good ones. I don't know. Can you think of too many good Vikings teams that didn't have a great pass rush? This is a franchise that if you can draw a through line through a lot of these good teams,
no doubt.
They've often had, when they're good, they've often had a great pass rush.
Yes. I mean, there are certain things that certain teams for. It's probably, defense, maybe linebackers in Pittsburgh. I mean, Green Bay, it's become quarterbacks. I don't know that was true forever, but you have teams that have these identities over the years. And I think for the Vikings, you could make the case for receivers too, with Carter, Moss, Jefferson, Percy Harvin, some of these kinds of things. But I think, yes, I would say if you look through Vikings history from the Purple People Eaters to the more current teams, the pass rushers are what they're known for. I mean, you go through, it's not just Eller and Page and Marshall. It's Chris Dolman. It's John Randall. It's Jared Allen. It's Everson Griffin. It's Brian Robinson. It's Daniil Hunter. You kind of go down the line, and I'm sure I'm missing a couple of them in the 90s probably as well. I mean, Dolman for a lot of it and Randall for a lot of it, but I feel like I'm probably missing a couple other, at least productive ones. That is very much the heritage of this franchise in a lot of ways. And yeah, I think it's a good point that piece of things is kind of part of the DNA. And the in terms of how those teams would match up, it is a different world in a lot of ways. I mean, you hear stories of back when they used to have to practice at Midway Stadium, and then if it snowed, they'd have to go. I think they went over to I've dug up a picture for the newsletter last year of them practicing at the State Fairgrounds Coliseum, I think around Thanksgiving. They had to go in there. That to Winter Park to the TCO Performance Center, it's such a different world. I remember hearing stories about, I think they had an early afternoon game in the late 70s trying to figure out if they're going to win the division. And Fran Tarkenton, Grady Alderman, and somebody else were, maybe even Tinkelhoff, were rented a camper. And they're sitting out in the Met Stadium parking lot listening to other games on the radio and having a couple beers after the game to try to figure out what's going to happen in terms of who they're going to play. And I mean, just it's almost like a different time. So it's fascinating to hear those stories. And you have a lot of guys on those old teams that are just interesting people. I mean, Jim Marshall was a fascinating guy in terms of writing poetry, and Matt Blair, it was photography. Alan Page, it's a million things, from tuba to running marathons to being a state Supreme Court justice. I mean, Carl Eller tells stories about, kind of growing up in the segregated South and what that was like. I mean, it's just a lot of guys on those teams that I think had opportunities to be people more so than just football players, probably in a way that we don't do now. I mean, Fran Tarkenton's had a successful business career. Ahmad Rashad's had a successful career after playing. I mean, a lot of these guys just are fascinating characters from that era. And I think some of that's probably Bud, that he let them do those things and gave them a little more space, but it's just a different time. And I think a lot of those guys, when you get the chance to talk to them, I mean, any day I get a chance to talk to Alan Page is a good day, because he's just a fascinating guy to listen to talk. You kind of one of those guys that you could listen to talk about just about anything.
Didn't they want Alan to stop running? And Alan was just like, I'm just going to keep running.
Yes. Yeah. I think that's part of the reason they ended up trading him to the Bears is he was running a marathon while he was playing for the Vikings.
Oh my God.
And Bud was like, no, I don't like this. We're getting him out of here. So yeah, I mean, think about that happening now. I mean, obviously, runners know Alan Page from the fact that on the Twin Cities Marathon Sunday, it's mile 3, he's still out in his front driveway, driving in the front of his house every year. If you've ever run the Twin Cities Marathon, you've seen him there with his tuba as people go by. It's this guy is one of for my money, the greatest player in Vikings history. Just out playing his tuba, having a good time, supporting runners and just, doing his thing. So, a level of accessibility between him and Bud always doing, come to my house and do the garage sale. And the number of times I covered that thing was, some, even though I didn't cover those teams, I feel like I've gotten to know a few of those guys just over the years. And, just fascinating people in a lot of cases. So a very fun group of guys to, even though I wasn't alive, to think about. And I'm sure for those that got to watch them, it's a lot of great memories about a lot of fascinating people.
Those are the stingiest garage sales ever, though, Bud.
They were.
Come on, Bud. He wouldn't autograph anything unless you bought something, and then if you bought something, the autograph was $25.
Bud was a child of the Depression.
And look, I respect it.
Bud was born in the 20s, so I don't think Bud had a ton of money growing up, and grew up in Superior, Wisconsin, which is different economically from Duluth. Speaking of stories we can't tell on this podcast, Andrew knows what I'm talking about.
Okay.
The conversation we had with Bud at an event up north. It was right after the game where he came out in the polo shirt at TCF.
Wow. Yep.
The Sub-Zero game, and I tried to get him going on, were you cold? And he said, well, heat is debilitating. Cold is not debilitating. And I said, yeah, but Bud, were you cold? And he never answered the question. And I think part of that was he knew the bit. I mean, he knew kind of what his brand was. And there's a lot of ways where I didn't I didn't want him to answer the question. If he'd said, yeah, it was freezing. Like, of course you're cold. But the mystique of Bud Grant was, no, I wasn't cold. Come on.
Yeah.
So it was, there was another story there that we'll keep off the podcast, but fascinating people all around, no doubt.
Well, thank you to everyone that sent in questions, whether we answered them or not. We appreciate you guys reaching out, being inquisitive about the team. Team's on summer break. We're going to go on a little bit of a summer break here for a little bit before the season starts up and we get drawn into 8 months straight of work and podcasting for you. So might be a couple weeks before you hear us on your feeds again, but there will be stuff up on the StarTribune.com. Like I mentioned on the last podcast, we've got some features coming. Surely the NFL will find ways to make news during our break and have someone writing. So definitely stay tuned there. But we will talk to you again once training camp is a little bit closer, and then things will really get moving here. Thanks for listening.